This guy right here looks like a 78-year-old grandpa in your local retirement home, but it's actually a 43-year-old George Blanda preparing to go onto the field and throw 3 touchdowns, kick a couple field goals, and clinch another late game victory. But this isn't just a story about some old guy playing in the NFL. It's about a guy who kept pushing, despite frequently being told he couldn't make it, someone who seemed to defy the normal human aging process, and was pretty darn clutch.
He was, I think, the greatest clutch player that the game has ever known.
By the way, if you're new here, welcome. This is NFL Unveiled, and if you like old school football, you're in the right place, because that's all we talk about. So George Blanda's career started like this. World War II had just ended. Yeah, World War II. The US was about to go into a massive economic boom. Meanwhile, George Blanda was getting ready to play pro football. He was then playing for the legendary coach Bear Bryant at Kentucky, and was the starter there for his final 2 years. Bryant apparently told Hallis, the Chicago Bears coach, that Blanda wouldn't make it to the NFL. His 26-year career kinda says otherwise. Although, it wasn't the worst take in fairness. Blanda's stats were nothing to write home about. A 49% completion percentage, 1,451 yards, 12 touchdowns, and 16 interceptions. Blanda himself didn't think he'd be playing after college. Turns out both of them were wrong, and he'd be drafted in the 12th round in 1949 by the Chicago Bears. George Halas, the founder, owner, and the coach, wasn't the #1 fan of Blanda, and there was tension between the two from day one. According to Blanda, Halas was too cheap to even buy me a kicking shoe. Disputes over money were a reoccurring theme. Blanda negotiated hard for his first contract, and then, after 4 years with no raises, Blanda was about to go to the CFL in 1952, but eventually Halas did submit and bumped his salary to $11,600. In between all of this bickering, you could say, after just 1 season in 1950, Blanda was traded to the Baltimore Colts. Not the same Baltimore Colts that are now the Indianapolis Colts, but a former version that went defunct after 1 year in the NFL. But after just 1 game, the Bears reacquired him. So that was an interesting detour in Blanda's career. Up until 1953, he had been a backup quarterback. He even played some linebacker and tailback. But in 1953, he got his shot. His first year as a starter, he led the league in attempts and completions, threw for over 2,000 yards, 14 touchdowns, and 24 interceptions. Now, the touchdown to interception ratio is obviously way off, but this is the 50s, that's pretty normal. That being said, it only got the Bears a 3-8-1 record. He did start the next season strong, throwing 15 touchdowns in 8 games, but he'd injure his shoulder and missed the final 4. And the Bears won all 4 of those without him, so Blanda, once again, was demoted to the bench. During one game, Bears fans chanted for Blanda to be subbed in during a blowout. So Halas got him off the bench, and Blanda laced up, ready to get onto the field, and then he gestured to the stands. Go up there, they want you. I guess that sums up their relationship. Not really friends, and Halas didn't think much of him as a quarterback. After another salary disagreement with Halas, as well as being typecasted as primarily a kicker, Blanda always believed he was a quarterback first, he chose to retire in 1959. Okay, I know the title says he refused to retire, but this didn't really count because it wouldn't be for long, even though Halas told him he'd never play again. A competitor league to the NFL had been created, the AFL, and a team from that league, the Houston Oilers, convinced George Blanda to come play for them. He led them to the 1960 title game in his first season, threw for 301 yards and 3 touchdowns in a 24-16 win over the LA Chargers. In 1961, he won the MVP, and he threw for a league-high 3,330 yards and 36 touchdowns, which was then the most touchdowns thrown by any NFL or AFL quarterback in a season, and it stood until 1986 when Dan Marino broke it. In that year's title game, he threw for 5 interceptions. He was then the 4th quarterback to do so in a playoff game, but he also became the first of those quarterbacks to win the game, as the Oilers won 10-3. 1962 would be more record-setting, good and bad. He threw 36 touchdowns again, which included a record 7 touchdowns in one game, tied for the most touchdowns in a single game. And he could have thrown for more, but early into the second half, it was such a blowout, he got pulled out of the game. The bad side of that season was that he threw 42 interceptions, a record that still stands to this day. He was also part of the longest game in NFL history, the 1962 AFL title game, which went to double overtime. That game he'd throw 5 interceptions again. Despite all those turnovers, somehow they made it to double overtime, but this time they wouldn't be so lucky, and they lost 20-17 against the Dallas Texans. He was one of the best quarterbacks in the AFL, He led the league in yards in 1961 and 1963, and in completions from 1963 to 1965, and the Oilers won the first 2 AFL titles. There were only 2 players to lead the league in completions for 3 consecutive years: George Blanda and Dan Marino. Despite the interceptions, he was a big reason they were winning so much. However, from 1963, the Oilers began to decline, and by 1967 they thought George Blanda was too old at 37, so they put him on waivers. The Raiders would see past the age on his birth certificate and give him a chance. He'd go on to lead the AFL in scoring in 1967 with 116 points. Now, Blanda is remembered for many things, but I don't think anything sticks out more than his reputation as the ultimate clutch player, which was established in 1970. Obviously, we're not saying he was the most clutch player ever, but this 5-game stretch was just amazing. Raiders quarterback Darryl LaMonica dealt with an injury-plagued season in 1970, so Blanda had to play a few extra snaps. Although the season almost never happened. Blanda was released in the 1970 exhibition season, but he was quickly re-signed before the regular season began. Up until this point, his role was primarily a kicker, throwing just 11 touchdown passes in his first 3 years with the Raiders. Turn on God mode. At 43 years young, he led the Raiders to 4 victories and 1 tie, with several game-winning touchdowns and field goals. The first came against the Steelers, as LaMonica was dealing with back spasms. So Blanda comes off the bench, throws 3 touchdowns, and was 7 of 12 for 148 yards in a 31-14 victory over Pittsburgh. The following game against the Chiefs, LaMonica did play, but it was Blanda who kicked a 48-yard field goal as time expired. Morris Stroud, a 6'9" tight end, was standing just in front of the goalpost. As the ball came, he leapt and almost blocked it, but it was just a little too high for him. So Blanda tied the game in the final seconds, 17-17 against the Chiefs. Next up, the Browns, who with just a couple minutes left, led 20-13. The Raiders had the ball with 69 yards to go. Blanda to the rescue. During a timeout on this drive, he runs to the sideline.
George said, I'll tell you what. He said, if you let me throw 3 slants to Warren Wells, I'll guarantee you a touchdown.
Blanda back to pass. Blanda looks, Blanda throws. Complete touchdown, Wells. Raiders score.
That is the original guarantee. Although I guess it's not the original guarantee. Namath's guarantee came before. But anyway, Blanda threw a game-tying touchdown with just over a minute left, and then he kicked the game winner to beat the Browns 23-20. The Raiders then faced the Broncos, but there's no way this streak continues, right? Well, I guess I already spoiled it at the beginning, so I don't know why I'm asking that. Blanda entered the game with just over 4 minutes to play, drove 80 yards, and threw a 20-yard touchdown to win 24-19. In San Diego the following week, LaMonica was starting again, but Blanda was, to no surprise, the hero. Despite missing 2 field goals earlier, he'd iced the game with a 16-yard field goal to beat the Chargers in the final moments. Fans sported Blanda for Mayor buttons after the game. Let me tell you, he'd have my vote. He'd also come off the bench in the AFC title game, completing 17 of 32 passes for 217 yards, 2 touchdowns, and a 48-yard field goal. They did lose, but Blanda became the oldest quarterback to play in an NFL championship game until Tom Brady took that crown. This crazy run would earn Blanda AFC Player of the Year in 1970, and he was also named AP Athlete of the Year, the first NFL player to ever receive the award. And get this, he did all of that just throwing 55 passes the entire year. Although Blanda didn't play much quarterback after this, he continued as their kicker for 5 more years. Blanda is one of only 2 players to play across 4 decades. But how did he do it? Well, life was a lot simpler back then. All he needed, meat, cigarettes, and bourbon. He didn't inhale the cigarettes, to his credit, and he sipped his bourbon, like a real man. 2 to 3 drinks max. Those were his own words. This was a ritual of Blanda's. Smoke cigarettes on the way to the locker room, in the locker room, and even on the field. Although a lot of players were doing that, to be fair. According to Blanda, his worst career performance came when he wasn't smoking at all. Len Dawson took notes, I see. Inducted into the Hall of Fame his first year of eligibility in 1981, Blanda retired with countless records and cemented one of the most unique careers in NFL history. The thing is, Blanda wasn't even planning to retire. The Raiders had drafted a kicker in 1976, but he was under the impression he'd be kept on as a backup. The Raiders let him go though, just 1 month shy of his 49th birthday, as the team's all-time leading scorer. This makes the 3rd time a team has declared me too old to play, only this time, they might be right.